The rain drummed against my windshield as I pulled up to the luxury hotel downtown. 23 years driving for rideshare apps, and I'd learned to read passengers within seconds. But the woman who slipped into my backseat that Tuesday evening was different. Her designer coat was soaked, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the seatbelt. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Drive without speaking." The words came out like a desperate prayer. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her face, pale, haunted, with the kind of fear that comes from running from something real. Her eyes darted to the windows, scanning the street behind us. I nodded and pulled into traffic. In my years behind the wheel, I'd heard confessions, witnessed breakdowns, and carried secrets across this city. But something about her silence felt heavier than words. She clutched a small leather purse against her chest, her knuckles white with tension. The radio played softly, a jazz station I kept on for nervous passengers. She flinched when a car honked nearby, then pressed herself deeper into the corner of the seat. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't just in her head. This was the kind of fear that comes with real consequences. If you've ever wondered about the stories that unfold in the back seats of our city, hit that subscribe button. You won't believe where this night takes us. As we merged onto the highway, I had no idea that in 30 minutes everything would make terrible, perfect sense. The highway stretched ahead of us, slick with rain and dotted with red taillights. My passenger hadn't moved in 10 minutes, hadn't even given me a destination. The GPS showed we were heading toward the suburbs, but she hadn't confirmed anything. I kept driving, following her earlier whispered direction to just go north. Her breathing had steadied, but I could still feel the tension radiating from the back seat. In the mirror, I watched her close her eyes and lean her head against the window. The leather purse never left her grip. Whatever was inside seemed to be the only thing anchoring her to reality. I'd seen this before. People running from domestic violence, from debts they couldn't pay, from mistakes that had grown too large to contain. But this felt different. Her clothes were expensive, her jewelry real. This wasn't about money or an abusive relationship. This was about something that had shattered her world completely. The radio DJ announced the time, 8:47 p.m. She opened her eyes and checked her phone, then quickly turned it face down. The screen had lit up with notifications, but she couldn't bear to read them. Her jaw tightened, and she pressed her lips together to keep from crying. 20 minutes into our silent journey, I began to understand that I wasn't just driving a passenger to safety. I was carrying someone who had crossed a line she could never uncross, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing her with every mile we traveled. The suburbs gave way to farmland as we continued north. My passenger had finally relaxed enough to let her shoulders drop, but her eyes remained fixed on the darkness outside. I noticed her wedding ring, a simple gold band that she kept twisting around her finger. Whatever had happened tonight had shattered more than just her evening. She was probably in her early 50s, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of a comfortable life. Her grey hair was styled in a way that suggested regular salon visits, and despite her distress, she carried herself with the bearing of someone used to being in control. That made her current state even more unsettling. The fuel gauge showed half a tank. I could drive for hours more if needed, but eventually we'd have to stop, and she'd have to decide where this journey was taking her. For now, she seemed content to let the miles accumulate between her and whatever she'd left behind in the city. A semi-truck passed us, its lights illuminating the interior of my car for a moment. In that brief flash, I saw her face clearly, not just afraid, but grieving. This wasn't about running from danger. This was about running from a truth she couldn't face. The purse in her lap contained more than belongings. It held the evidence of something that had destroyed everything she thought she knew. As we approached a small town, its lights twinkling in the distance, I realized that my role tonight wasn't just as a driver. I was a witness to the moment when someone's carefully constructed life had collapsed, and they were trying to figure out how to exist in the aftermath. Millbrook appeared through the rain like something from a postcard, a main street lined with antique shops, and a diner with neon signs that had probably been glowing since the 1950s. My passenger stirred as we slowed for the town's single traffic light. For the first time since she'd entered my car, she spoke. "Stop here," she said, her voice hoarse from silence. please. I pulled into the parking lot of the diner, its windows glowing warm against the cold night. She made no move to get out, just stared at the building as if it held significance I couldn't understand. Through the windows, I could see the late-night crowd, truckers, shift workers, insomniacs seeking coffee and human connection. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where someone could disappear into a corner booth and think, maybe that's what she needed. She finally opened the purse and pulled out a thick envelope. Her hand shook as she held it, and I caught a glimpse of photographs spilling from the edges, black and white images, but I couldn't make out the details. Whatever they showed had been important enough to run with, important enough to abandon her life for. "I used to come here," she whispered, more to herself than to me. 25 years ago, when I thought I knew who I was. The weight of those words settled between us like fog. This wasn't a random stop. This was a pilgrimage to a version of herself that no longer existed. She paid the fare without looking at me, adding a generous tip that suggested guilt more than gratitude. As she stepped out into the rain, I watched her pause at the diner's entrance. Through the glass, she was studying the faces inside, searching for something or someone from her past. I should have driven away then. My shift was ending, and I had my own life to return to. But something kept me in that parking lot, engine idling, watching this woman confront whatever ghosts had brought her to this forgotten town. She pushed through the door, and I saw the waitress look up with recognition. That's when I knew this wasn't random. She hadn't just asked me to drive north. She'd been heading here specifically, to this place that held memories from before her world fell apart. The envelope clutched in her hand contained more than photographs. It contained the reason she could never go home. My radio crackled with dispatch offering me another fare back in the city. I almost accepted it, almost drove away from this strange night and its silent passenger. But as I watched her slide into a corner booth, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, I realized I was invested now. I needed to know what had broken this woman so completely. I turned off the engine and settled in to wait. Through the diner windows, I could see her spreading the photographs across the table while the waitress brought her coffee. Whatever story those images told, it was about to unfold in a place where she'd once felt safe, before she learned that safety was just an illusion we tell ourselves. From my car, I could see the conversation unfolding inside the diner. The waitress, a woman about the same age as my passenger, had sat down across from her. They weren't strangers. The way they leaned toward each other, the careful way the waitress handled the photographs, suggested a friendship that had survived decades of separation. My passenger was crying now, not the silent tears she'd shed in my car, but the kind of weeping that comes from finally having someone who understands. The waitress reached across the table and covered her hand, and for the first time since she'd gotten into my car, my passenger's shoulders relaxed. I checked my phone, 9:30 p.m. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the diner's neon sign reflected in puddles across the parking lot. A few other customers had left, giving the two women more privacy for whatever revelation was unfolding. The envelope lay open between them, its contents spread like evidence at a crime scene. The waitress got up and returned with a pot of coffee, refilling both their cups with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for years, but her attention never left my passenger's face. Whatever story was being told, it was one that required careful listening and gentle responses. Through the window, I watched my passenger point to one of the photographs, then cover her face with her hands. The waitress nodded grimly, as if confirming something she'd long suspected. This wasn't a reunion, this was a confession, and the diner had become an impromptu confessional for sins that couldn't be absolved anywhere else. An hour passed before my passenger emerged from the diner. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the night air crisp and clean. She moved differently now, not with the frantic energy of someone running, but with the heavy steps of someone carrying a burden she could no longer hide. The envelope was sealed again, but I could tell its contents had been shared. She approached my car slowly, as if unsure whether I'd waited. When she saw me behind the wheel, something like relief crossed her face. She needed a witness to this night, someone who had seen her journey from the beginning. I was no longer just her driver. I was the only person who understood the full arc of her flight from whatever truth had shattered her world. "Thank you," she said as she settled back into the seat. For waiting. Her voice was steadier now, but underneath the composure, I could hear the exhaustion of someone who had finally stopped running. She gave me an address, not in the city where I'd picked her up, but in a small town another hour north. As we pulled back onto the highway, she began to speak. Not to me directly, but to the darkness outside the window, as if she needed to practice the words she'd soon have to say to someone else. "I thought I was protecting everyone," she whispered. "But secrets don't protect people. They just postpone the pain." The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but I knew we were driving toward more than just another destination. We were heading toward the moment when she'd have to face the consequences of whatever truth she'd been hiding, and the envelope in her lap contained the evidence that would change everything for someone else. The highway was nearly empty now, just us and the occasional truck carrying goods through the night. My passenger had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the desperate quiet of someone hiding, but the contemplative stillness of someone preparing for what came next. She kept checking her phone, though she never answered the calls that kept coming. "He doesn't know yet," she said, suddenly startling me. It was the first time she'd acknowledged that I was listening, that I'd become a reluctant confidant in whatever drama was unfolding. "My husband. He's probably wondering why I didn't come home from book club. He has no idea that his entire life is about to change." The words hung between us like a confession. Whatever was in that envelope, whatever had sent her fleeing into the night, involved more than just her own secrets. She was carrying the kind of truth that destroys families, the kind that makes people wish they could unknow what they'd learned. And now she was racing toward the moment when she'd have to share that burden with someone else. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her staring at her wedding ring again. 40 years of marriage, she'd told the waitress. 4 decades of thinking she knew the man she'd shared her life with, only to discover that love and knowledge weren't the same thing. The photographs in her purse had shattered that illusion completely. As we approached the next exit, she leaned forward and gave me more specific directions. We were heading to a residential area, to a house where someone was sleeping peacefully, unaware that their world was about to be torn apart by the truth that couldn't be hidden any longer. The address led us to a quiet neighborhood where porch lights glowed like beacons in the darkness. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a garden that someone tended with care and a mailbox painted with cheerful flowers. It looked like the kind of place where people lived simple, honest lives, which made my passenger's presence there all the more jarring. She asked me to wait again, but this time she left the envelope on the seat beside her. Whatever confrontation awaited her inside that house, she wasn't ready to bring the evidence with her. Not yet. She needed to prepare whoever lived there for what was coming, to find words that might soften the blow of a truth that would change everything. Through the front window, I could see lights coming on as she rang the doorbell. A woman appeared, younger than my passenger, maybe in her 30s, with the kind of sleepy confusion that comes from unexpected late-night visitors. But when she saw who was standing on her porch, confusion turned to concern, then to something that looked like dread. They embraced on the doorstep, and I realized I was watching a mother and daughter reunited by crisis. The younger woman ushered my passenger inside, and through the window I could see them settling in the living room. Whatever conversation was about to happen, it would determine whether the secrets in that envelope remained buried or finally saw the light of day. The neighborhood was so quiet I could hear the wind rustling through the trees. Somewhere in that peaceful house, a family was about to learn that the past they thought they knew was built on lies, and the woman who'd ridden in silence through the night was about to become the messenger of their destruction. 20 minutes passed before my passenger emerged from the house. She wasn't alone. The younger woman followed her to the car, her face pale with shock. They stood beside my vehicle, speaking in urgent whispers, and I could see the family resemblance now. The same determined jawline, the same way of holding their shoulders when facing something difficult. "Mom, you can't do this alone," the daughter was saying as my passenger reached for the envelope. "Not after all these years. Let me come with you." But my passenger shook her head firmly. This was her burden to bear, her truth to tell. She'd already involved too many people in the wreckage of her discovery. The daughter looked at me through the window, as if trying to assess whether I could be trusted with whatever family crisis was unfolding. I'd become an unwitting participant in their drama, the silent witness to a night that would divide their lives into before and after. She seemed to decide I was harmless enough, because she stepped back and let her mother get into the car. "Call me when it's over," she said, her voice breaking. "Promise me you'll call." My passenger nodded and clutched the envelope tighter. Whatever she'd told her daughter had been enough to explain the gravity of the situation, but not enough to share the burden. Some truths were too heavy to distribute among the people you love. As we pulled away from the house, I saw the daughter standing in her driveway, watching our taillights disappear into the night. She was probably wondering if she'd ever see her mother again, if whatever confrontation lay ahead would destroy more than just the secrets that had been hidden for so long. "Take me back to the city," my passenger said, her voice steady despite everything. "To Riverside Drive, number 847. I recognized the address. An upscale neighborhood where successful people lived successful lives, where secrets could be buried under layers of respectability and social standing. We were heading back to where this had all started, but she was returning as a different person than the one who'd fled. The drive back felt longer than our journey north, weighted down by the knowledge of what awaited us. She sat straighter now, no longer the broken woman who'd begged for silence. She'd found her courage somewhere in that small town, in the diner with her old friend, in the conversation with her daughter. Now she was preparing to use it. 42 years, she said, breaking the silence as we passed the city limits. That's how long I've been married, how long I thought I knew the man I shared my life with. You'd think after 4 decades, there wouldn't be any surprises left. You'd think you'd know someone completely. Her laugh was bitter, tinged with the kind of disillusionment that comes from having your worldview shattered. The envelope rustled as she shifted in her seat, and I caught another glimpse of the photographs inside, black and white images that looked like they'd been taken decades ago, but preserved with the kind of care that suggested they were evidence of something important, something that had been hidden for so long that its revelation would feel like an earthquake. As we entered her neighborhood, I realized I was about to witness the end of this strange journey. Whatever truth she'd discovered, whatever secret had sent her fleeing into the night, was about to be confronted in the house where she'd built her life on what she now knew were lies. Number 847. Riverside Drive was a beautiful colonial with mature trees and carefully tended landscaping. Every window glowed with warm light, and I could see a figure moving around inside. Her husband, probably wondering where she'd been for the past 4 hours. He had no idea that his wife was sitting in my back seat, preparing to destroy the foundation of everything they'd built together. She paid me again, this time with hands that barely trembled. The transformation was complete. She'd gone from a terrified woman fleeing the truth to someone ready to confront it head-on. The envelope was tucked securely under her arm, its contents about to be revealed to the one person who had the most to lose from their exposure. "Thank you," she said as she opened the car door, "for the silence, for the waiting, for being exactly what I needed tonight." I nodded, understanding that I'd played a crucial role in her journey from discovery to acceptance. Sometimes people need a witness to their transformation, someone who can see them change from who they were into who they need to become. She walked up the front steps with purpose, her key already in her hand. Through the front window, I could see her husband look up with relief as she entered. He moved toward her with the kind of concern that comes from genuine love, but she held up her hand to stop him. Even from outside, I could see the moment when he noticed the envelope. Stories like this one remind us that truth has its own timeline, and sometimes the most important conversations happen in the middle of the night. If you're finding value in these real-life confessions, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments. As I prepared to drive away, I realized the real drama was just beginning inside that house. I should have driven away then, but something kept me parked across the street. Through their front window, I could see my passenger and her husband in what was clearly an intense conversation. She was showing him the photographs, one by one, and with each image, his posture changed. Confusion gave way to recognition, then to something that looked like defeat. The envelope was empty now. Its contents spread across their coffee table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture no one wanted to see. Her husband had his head in his hands, and she was sitting rigidly upright, no longer the comforting wife, but the bearer of uncomfortable truths. Whatever those photographs showed, they were undeniable evidence of something he'd hoped would never surface. A police car drove slowly through the neighborhood on its routine patrol, and I realized how strange I must look. A rideshare driver parked outside a house at midnight, watching a domestic drama unfold. But I couldn't leave, not yet. I'd invested too much in this woman's journey to abandon her at the moment when everything she'd worked toward came to fruition. Her husband stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the street without seeing me. His shoulders shook, and I realized he was crying. Not the angry tears of someone who'd been betrayed, but the broken sobs of someone whose past had finally caught up with them. The photographs weren't revealing his wife's secrets, they were exposing his own. The living room light went out, but I could see them moving to the kitchen, where the conversation continued under harsh fluorescent lighting. Whatever resolution they were working toward, it wouldn't come easily. Some truths require hours of discussion, years of rebuilding, or the complete destruction of everything that came before. My radio crackled with another fare request, but I declined it. I'd been sitting outside their house for over an hour, watching through windows as a marriage either died or transformed. The kitchen light was still on, and I could see them sitting across from each other at a table that had probably hosted thousands of ordinary meals, now serving as the stage for an extraordinary reckoning. Her husband had aged visibly in the past hour. Whatever the photographs revealed, whatever secrets he'd carried for decades, the burden of hiding them had finally broken him. My passenger sat across from him with the patience of someone who understood that some confessions take time, that 42 years of lies couldn't be unraveled in a single conversation. I thought about my own marriage, my own secrets, the small deceptions that every relationship carries, the white lies that smooth over rough patches. But this was different. This was the kind of secret that redefines everything that came before it, that makes you question whether the life you thought you were living was real or just an elaborate performance. A light came on in an upstairs window, probably their bedroom. Were they preparing to sleep in the same bed after this revelation? Or had the photographs created a chasm too wide to bridge? Some couples survive the truth, others are destroyed by it. The difference often comes down to whether love is stronger than the need for the familiar lies that made life comfortable. As dawn approached, I realized I was witnessing something rare, the moment when people choose between the comfortable fiction of their constructed lives and the difficult reality of who they actually are. The outcome would determine not just their future, but how they understood their entire past. The first hint of sunrise was touching the horizon when the front door of 847 Riverside Drive opened again. My passenger emerged alone, but she looked different than she had when she'd entered. There was a lightness to her step, a straightness to her spine that suggested the weight she'd carried all night had finally been shared. Her husband appeared in the doorway behind her, and they embraced, not with passion, but with the careful tenderness of people who were learning to trust each other again. She walked toward my car with purpose, but when she reached the passenger door, she paused. Through the windshield, I could see her husband watching from the porch, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Whatever the photographs had revealed, whatever secrets had been exposed, they'd decided to face the consequences together. "I thought you might still be here," she said as she got into the car. "I hoped you would be." Her voice was different now, tired, but not defeated. She'd done what she came to do, had the conversation that needed to happen, and somehow both she and her marriage had survived it. The envelope was gone, left behind in the house where its secrets could no longer do damage through hiding. "Where to now?" I asked, the first words I'd spoken to her since our journey began. She smiled, a real smile this time, not the brittle expression of someone holding themselves together through crisis. "Nowhere," she said. "Everywhere. For the first time in months, it doesn't matter. The truth is out and we're still here." As we pulled away from Riverside Drive, I realized I'd witnessed something extraordinary. Not the destruction of a marriage by truth, but its reconstruction on a foundation of honesty. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and some truths are strong enough to survive their own revelation. As we drove through the awakening city, My passenger finally told me what had been in those photographs. Her husband's first wife, who he'd claimed died in a car accident 30 years before they met, was very much alive. The pictures showed her in a psychiatric facility where she'd been committed after what the family had called a nervous breakdown, but was actually her discovery of her husband's financial crimes. He had her declared incompetent, my passenger explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Took control of her assets, had her institutionalized, and then simply disappeared from her life. Started over in a new city with a new identity. That's where I met him, when he was pretending to be a widower who'd lost the love of his life to tragedy. The photographs had been sent to her by a private investigator hired by the first wife's sister, who'd spent decades trying to prove what had happened. The sister had finally tracked down my passenger, hoping she could convince her husband to do right by the woman he'd abandoned. Instead, she'd discovered that her own marriage was built on a foundation of lies and stolen money. The worst part, she continued, wasn't learning that he'd lied to me. It was realizing that I'd been living off money stolen from a woman who was still alive, still suffering, still wondering why the man she loved had abandoned her when she needed him most. Every comfortable thing in our life, our house, our vacations, our retirement fund, it all came from her. The city was coming alive around us as we drove, people starting their normal days with no idea that somewhere among them, a woman was grappling with the discovery that her entire adult life had been built on someone else's tragedy. We stopped at a small cafe that was just opening for the morning rush. My passenger needed coffee, needed to sit somewhere normal while she processed what came next. The barista was cheerful in the way that only early morning workers can be, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded through the night. Sometimes, the most profound moments of our lives happen against the backdrop of complete normalcy. He agreed to everything, she said, as we sat at a corner table. The restitution, the medical care, even visiting her, if she'll allow it. I think part of him was relieved to finally stop running from what he'd done. 30 years is a long time to carry that kind of guilt. She stirred her coffee absently, still processing the conversation that had lasted until dawn. The morning news played on a small television above the counter, and I watched her tense as the anchor began a story about financial fraud. Every headline felt personal now, every story about deception and betrayal a reflection of her own experience. She'd joined the ranks of people who'd discovered that the person they trusted most was capable of unthinkable cruelty. The hardest part is figuring out what was real, she continued. Did he love me, or was I just part of his cover story? Were our 42 years together genuine, or was I married to a performance? How do you separate the man you loved from the crimes he committed before you knew him? These were questions that couldn't be answered quickly. Wounds that would take years to heal. But there was something else in her voice now. Not just pain, but purpose. She'd spent the night running from the truth, but now she was ready to face its implications. The woman in the psychiatric facility deserved justice, deserved to know that someone cared about what had happened to her, deserved to have her story told. By the time we left the cafe, the city was fully awake. My passenger had made a series of phone calls to lawyers, to the private investigator, to victim advocacy groups. The machinery of justice was slow, but it was beginning to turn. What had started as a personal crisis was becoming something larger, a reckoning that would ripple out beyond her marriage to touch everyone who'd been affected by her husband's crimes. I keep thinking about her, she said as we drove through downtown. Margaret, that's her name. She's 73 years old and she spent half her life in that facility, convinced that she was crazy, that her memories of what happened weren't real. Tomorrow, she's going to learn that she was right all along, that the man she loved really did betray her in the worst possible way. The weight of that knowledge was staggering. Somewhere in the city was a woman who'd been gaslit so thoroughly that she'd questioned her own sanity, who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect her. My passenger was about to become the messenger of both vindication and renewed trauma, the person who would confirm Margaret's worst fears while also offering her first real hope for justice. "Will you visit her?" I asked. It was a question that had been building in my mind since she'd told me the story. How do you face someone whose life was destroyed to build your own comfort? How do you apologize for benefits you didn't know you were receiving from someone else's suffering? She nodded slowly. I have to. I owe her that much. I owe her everything, really. An apology, an explanation, and whatever help I can give her now. It won't undo 30 years of injustice, but it's a start. It's the only way I can live with myself going forward. 3 days later, I drove my passenger to Willowbrook Psychiatric Facility, an hour outside the city. She'd asked specifically for me, saying she needed someone who understood the full story, someone who'd witnessed her journey from denial to acceptance. The building was modern and clean, but it couldn't disguise the fact that it was a place where people went when the world became too much to bear. Margaret was waiting in the visiting room, a small woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes that had seen too much. She moved carefully, with the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned that sudden movements attracted unwanted attention from staff. When she saw my passenger approach, her expression shifted from curiosity to recognition, not of the person, but of the significance of the moment. You're her, Margaret said simply. The second wife. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just the weary acknowledgement of someone who'd finally received confirmation of truths she'd carried for decades. My passenger nodded and sat down across from her, the same careful distance she'd maintained with her husband during their own confrontation. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Two women, separated by decades and circumstances, finding common ground in their shared experience of loving a man who'd proven capable of unthinkable betrayal. Margaret's voice was soft but clear as she described the night her husband had her committed, the years of being told her memories were delusions, the slow erosion of her confidence in her own perceptions. I knew I wasn't crazy, she said at one point. But when everyone around you insists that you are, when the person you trust most tells you that your own memories are lies, you start to doubt everything. Even now, even with proof, part of me wonders if I'm imagining this conversation. The visit lasted 2 hours, and by the end, something had shifted between them. Not friendship. That would take time if it was even possible, but understanding. They were both victims of the same man's capacity for deception, separated by time, but united by their experience of having their reality systematically dismantled by someone they'd trusted completely. Margaret had questions about the life her husband had built with her money, her assets, her stolen future. My passenger answered them honestly, describing the house Margaret had unknowingly paid for, the vacations funded by her inheritance, the comfortable retirement built on the foundation of her suffering. Each revelation was a small wound, but also a validation, proof that Margaret's memories of their shared wealth were real, that her suspicions about the missing money had been accurate. What happens now? Margaret asked as the visit wound down. It was the question that hung over everything. How do you rebuild a life that was stolen from you 30 years ago? How do you find justice when the crime was so perfectly executed that even the victim had been convinced it hadn't happened? The legal process would be complex and lengthy. Statutes of limitations had expired on some crimes, but others, the fraud, the false commitment, the theft of assets, might still be prosecutable. More importantly, Margaret would finally receive proper psychiatric care, treatment based on the truth of what had happened to her, rather than the fiction that had been constructed to hide her husband's crimes. As we prepared to leave, Margaret reached across the table and touched my passenger's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for coming here, for giving me back my sanity." It was a moment of grace that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together, a recognition that sometimes the most important gift we can give someone is the validation of their truth. The weeks that the silence stretched between us as I processed what she'd revealed. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but I could see the slight tremor in her fingers. The radio continued its coverage of the accident, mentioning the ongoing investigation into the cause of the collision. Every word seemed to echo in the confined space of my car. 23 years, she whispered, breaking the quiet. 23 years I've carried this weight. Do you know what that does to a person? Every birthday of his that passed, every Christmas, every moment when his parents wondered what happened to their son. Her voice cracked slightly, the composure she'd maintained finally beginning to fracture. I found myself slowing down, though we were still several miles from her destination. This wasn't just a confession anymore. It was a reckoning. The woman beside me had lived with a secret that had shaped every day of her adult life. The guilt had carved lines into her face, had probably influenced every major decision she'd made since that night in 1999. The other driver today, she continued, when I heard about the collision on the radio, something inside me just broke. I kept thinking about his family, about how they're going through exactly what I put another family through all those years ago, the not knowing, the questions that will never have answers. The weight of her words settled over us both. I realized that this ride had become something neither of us had anticipated, a moment of human connection forged in the crucible of long-buried truth. Whatever happened next would change both of our lives forever. I pulled into a gas station parking lot, my hands shaking slightly as I put the car in park. Margaret didn't protest the stop. She seemed to understand that this conversation required more than the confines of a moving vehicle. The fluorescent lights from the station cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look older, more fragile than when she'd first gotten into my car. "What are you going to do?" I asked, the question hanging heavy between us. It wasn't my place to judge or advise, but I couldn't pretend this conversation hadn't affected me. In my years of driving, I'd heard confessions, arguments, celebrations, and heartbreak, but nothing quite like this. Margaret stared out the windshield at the empty parking lot. I've been asking myself that same question for hours. When I called for this ride, I thought I was just going to visit my sister. But hearing about that accident today, seeing how it affected me, maybe it was a sign. Maybe it's time to stop running from what I did. She turned to look at me directly for the first time since her confession began. Her eyes were red-rimmed but determined. "You're the first person I've ever told. In 23 years, you're the only one who knows the truth about what happened to David Chen. That has to mean something, doesn't it?" The responsibility of her secret felt enormous. I thought about David's family, still wondering what had happened to their son. I thought about Margaret, who had been imprisoned by her guilt for over 2 decades. There were no easy answers here, no clear path forward that wouldn't cause pain to someone. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. The device looked foreign in her hands, as if she was seeing it for the first time. She stared at the screen for a long moment before looking back at me. "Will you wait with me while I make a call? I don't think I can do this alone." I nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was about to do. She dialed a number slowly, each digit seeming to require enormous effort. When someone answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Hello. I need to speak with someone about a cold case from 1999, a hit and run involving David Chen." The conversation that followed was brief but life-changing. Margaret provided basic details, her address, and agreed to come in the following morning. When she hung up, she sat in silence for several minutes, as if processing what she'd just set in motion. 23 years, she said again, but this time her voice carried something different, not just regret, but a kind of relief. "I know it won't bring him back. I know his family will hate me. I know I'll probably go to prison, but maybe they'll finally have answers. Maybe they can have some kind of closure." I started the car again, and we continued toward her sister's house. The radio was still playing, but the news had moved on to other stories. The accident that had triggered Margaret's confession was already becoming yesterday's news, but its impact would ripple through her life forever. As we drove through the quiet neighborhoods, I found myself thinking about the randomness of human connection. If she'd gotten a different driver, if the radio had been playing music instead of news, if the accident had happened on a different day, would she ever have found the courage to face her past? We pulled up to a modest house with a well-tended garden and warm lights glowing in the windows. Margaret sat for a moment, gathering herself before facing her sister. I wondered if she would tell her family what she'd decided to do, or if she'd carry this final burden alone until tomorrow morning. "Thank you," she said as she reached for the door handle. "I know this wasn't what you expected when you picked up a fare tonight. You didn't have to listen, but you did. You didn't have to stop and wait while I made that call, but you did. Sometimes strangers can be kinder than the people who know us best." I watched her walk slowly toward the house, her shoulders straighter than they'd been when she first got into my car. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was finally ready to face it. The door opened before she reached it, and I saw a woman who must have been her sister embrace her warmly, unknowing of the conversation that had just taken place. As I drove away, I thought about the weight of secrets and the power of confession. Margaret had carried her guilt for 23 years, and in the span of a single car ride, she'd found the courage to finally seek redemption. It wouldn't be easy. There would be legal consequences, family trauma, and the pain of facing David's loved ones. But there would also be truth, finally, after more than 2 decades of silence. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment that changed everything? Let us know. Your story might be the next one we tell.